Hi there, and welcome to our first in our series of our international relations videos. This one here is on the beginnings of the Cold War and looks at the breakdown of the wartime alliance. So, what about the background then? So, the Second World War was fought between the Allies, United Kingdom, United States, USSR, and the Axis powers, which are Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. So, the Allies were united by one clear thing, and that was the destruction of Hitler's Germany. However, despite this common goal, deep differences simmered below the surface, which were soon to emerge as the war neared its conclusion. And you can see in the picture here Churchill on the left hand side, representing Great Britain. You've got Roosevelt from the United States in the middle, who's gravely ill at this stage, and you've got Stalin, the dictator, in charge of the Soviet Union. So, bit of ideology then. So there were clear ideological differences here. Okay, United States, United Kingdom, they shared their democratic and capitalist background. Okay, and you commonly call these powers the West. Okay, so what about this democracy and capitalism? What's that all about? Well, this simply means that they believed in a system in which the government is chosen by the people in regular and fair elections. Rights such as freedom of the press and of speech are guaranteed. What's capitalism then? Well, capitalism is a system based on the freedom to make money, to make capital. This provides a lot of opportunity in society and can lead to like vast wealth, but it can also lead to huge inequality as well. What about communism then? Well, the Soviet Union was founded in 1917 and it's supposed to be a workers' paradise. It was meant to be a one party, well, sorry, it is a one party, was a one party communist state. So this simply means that they believed in a communist society in which everyone was supposed to be equal. It believed capitalism was wrong and only created inequality and division. And communism, this Marxist communism that you have on offer here, it had strong authoritarian government in which there was only one party, the Communist Party. Human rights were restricted to preserve the system. So the USSR felt that the West had been really intent on destroying the new communist state from the very start. And these ideological differences had created these long suspicions. USA and UK, they believed that the USSR was intent on spreading communism across the world. However, the Second World War had seen them setting their differences aside to defeat Hitler. So what about the Yalta Conference? So Yalta Conference, February 1945. As the war neared its end in Europe, the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, they met at Yalta in the Crimea, which is part of the Soviet Union at the time, to discuss the post-war world. So you have Stalin and the USSR. What did Stalin want? Well, he wanted a buffer zone of Eastern European countries controlled by the Soviet Union to prevent the USSR ever being invaded again. The USSR had been attacked by surprise by Nazi Germany in 1941 and it lost over 25 million of its own people trying to liberate the country and defeat Hitler and the Nazis. Security then, therefore, for Stalin and for the Soviet Union was vital. Churchill. Well, Churchill was very wary of Stalin. He didn't trust him and very wary of the Soviet Union. And he warned of their control of Eastern Europe. Churchill aims for Britain to try to preserve as much of its global influence and its global empire as possible after that brutal war. What about Roosevelt then? Well, Roosevelt was gravely ill at the time, but he was less suspicious of Stalin than Churchill, and his aim was to create a workable United Nations to help prevent warfare in future. What did they agree then? Well, Germany was to be divided at the end of the war into four zones. We've got the United Kingdom, USA, USSR, and France. Berlin was also to be divided in this way as well. Germany was to be made to pay reparations for all the damage it had caused. United Nations was to be set up in New York. The Eastern Europe was to be in the Soviet sphere of influence and recognized as such, but it was agreed that these countries within that zone should be able to choose their own governments in elections. And borders regarding Poland were also agreed. So, despite some tensions, Yalta was actually generally quite a productive meeting, with both sides clearly happy that the war was coming to an end and making some compromises. What about Potsdam then? Well, you can see Potsdam is further on in the year. It's July 1945. By that stage, Germany is defeated, and there's only Japan left to beat. So what had changed then? Well, the Potsdam Agreement was in July 1945, hugely different to Yalta in February, and relationships had already started to cool and become a lot more tense. So first of all, if you're looking at that photograph just past, or if you can see the photograph on the right-hand side, you can see there's changes. There's literally only one person left from that previous photograph in Yalta, and that person left is Stalin. But by Potsdam, Roosevelt had died and been replaced by President Harry Truman. Churchill had been voted out while he was there and replaced by Attlee in the United Kingdom. Only Stalin remained. So Truman was more suspicious of Stalin than Roosevelt ever had been. You also have Hitler dead by this stage. It's July 1945, Hitler was dead, Germany was defeated, and the glue of that common enemy was now gone between East and West. And you also have this idea of Soviet control. So the USSR now occupied Eastern Europe with its huge Red Army. It had shocked the Americans and the British by their often terribly brutal control of occupied countries. Germany had been stripped of its resources by the USSR. Many women were treated absolutely terribly. Puppet regimes controlled by Moscow were put into Eastern European countries as governments, and elections were often rigged in those countries in favour of the communists. Fourthly, you've got the atomic bomb. By Potsdam, Truman knew that the atomic bombs worked. This had been a top secret US project to develop nuclear weapons. Stalin, however, did know through his spy network and was beginning his own program to try to develop their own nuclear bombs. Truman felt that the bombs gave America the edge and perhaps shaped attitudes towards Stalin at the time. What was agreed at Potsdam then? Well, Germans were to be demilitarized and must pay reparations. However, differences were beginning to emerge on this idea about needing reparations at this stage. What about Japan? Well, the USSR said that they would begin to get involved in the fight against Japan. They hadn't actually officially declared war in Japan, so up until this point, there was little conflict between the two powers. Polish borders were drawn up and taking German land to allow the USSR to gobble up Polish land in the east, and there was disagreement. What was clear at Potsdam was that the alliance was crumbling, and tensions were already beginning to emerge over the atomic bomb secrets and treatment of Eastern Europe. So there's growing tensions. Stalin was angry and suspicious about Western intentions, especially after the atomic bomb secret. He felt the bomb had been developed to intimidate the USSR. The dropping of the two bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 seemed to the USSR as an attempt to show their power rather than to win the war. He also felt his desire for security was actually reasonable considering the huge Soviet death toll in the war, over 25 million dead. This was huge in comparison to the West death toll. Stalin was determined also to get his buffer zone. So there's growing tensions in the United States. Okay, Truman feared the spread of communism. He feared that Stalin may replace Hitler as a threat. He was angry at how the Soviet Union controlled Eastern Europe. He and Churchill worried about letting down Eastern Europe by abandoning them. So what to Stalin was a buffer zone looked to Truman like the start of a Soviet empire, and he did not want that one bit. So Winston Churchill, the famous ex-British Prime Minister, is invited by Truman to make a speech in 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, at the invitation of President Truman. So it'd be a highly controversial speech. He's going to suggest about an iron curtain being drawn across Europe from the north to the south. So he suggests in the speech that Europe is divided by an iron curtain that split east and west. He suggested those on the eastern side were controlled by the USSR and their freedoms were curtailed. He also argued that this was a danger to Europe and the free world, and that the eastern powers should build on their alliance that had worked so well in the war in response to this new threat from the communist state. What about the Iron Curtain speech reactions then? Well, Churchill wasn't even Prime Minister at the time of the speech. However, he was a world famous character and the man who had warned about Hitler in the 1930s and stood up to Malone in the Second World War. So his views were respected. With Truman at the speech, it suggested US government support. Stalin was furious. He claimed his actions in Eastern Europe were purely defensive and understandable considering so much Soviet loss. in the war. The speech increased East-West tension significantly. Many thanks for watching. Hopefully this helps.